Messiah? Can he be Messiah? The one whom the prophets foretold? The love that he teaches, the message he preaches, is it he in the scriptures of old?
And God said to Abraham, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. And Abraham rose up early in the morning, and took Isaac his son, and split the wood for the burnt offering, and laid it upon Isaac. And he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they went both of them together. And they came to the place which God had told him of. And Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay his son.
Abraham didn't have to use this knife. Some 4,000 years ago, here on Mount Moriah, God provided a substitute, a ram caught in the thicket by its horn. He was sacrificed instead of Isaac, and so we were able to have the Hebrew people. Well, Abraham lived an interesting life, and probably the most interesting part to us was when he came here to Mount Moriah. God told him to make a journey to the land of Moriah in Genesis 22. Upon a certain mountain, he said, I will tell thee of. And tradition has it that this is Mount Moriah. The temples were always built here in the past. You can see the wall of the temple behind me. It's been torn down and rebuilt and so forth, but it's in the same position, and that's the way it looked. He lived a fascinating life, this Abraham. He was the beginning of what we know as redemption, God buying back the soul. Abraham was born not in Israel, of course, but in Ur of the Chaldees, a very flourishing city over on the Persian Gulf in what is now Iraq. This was one of the points in which archaeologists used to doubt the Bible because they hadn't found Ur for a long time. But when it was found, it proved to be quite a metropolis with a university and libraries, public buildings with records of international commerce, cuneiform tablets. Out of that pagan milieu came this man Abraham, whom God said, get thee up and go to Canaan. And there God was going to establish a new people and a promised land. It was quite a covenant that God gave to Abraham. He would be the father of a great nation. They would bless many nations, and whoever would bless them, God would bless. And whoever would curse them, God would curse. So Abraham came here to Canaan, and he sojourned as a nomad. He went around with a tent and with animals, like a Bedouin. Today we see these shadows of the desert with their robes and their small flocks and their tents, and they move from place to place. Well, those are the Bedouins, and Abraham lived that way. When he came here, first there was a problem of a famine, and he was obliged to go to Egypt to begin with. In that, he's a little like Messiah, early in his career to Egypt and then back to the Promised Land. Down in Egypt, he had a problem with Pharaoh because he introduced his wife Sarah as his sister, just so that they wouldn't kill him to get his wife off of him. And no less a personage than Pharaoh was enamored of Sarah, and Abraham ended up with flocks and so forth as a reward. And this was an indiscretion. He did it again in Canaan with King Abimelech. So if we read Abraham's life carefully, it was a life of faith. It also had some sin. Well, the important part was when Abraham came back to Canaan, and by the way, the Egyptian Pharaoh told him to get out of the land of Egypt. Here was a pagan king telling the friend of God he was not morally fit to live among the sun worshippers of Egypt. Well, when he came back to the promised land, God gave him a real promise that they would have a son. And he waited a long time. The promise was 25 years in advance. Abraham grew tired of waiting. He took his maid Hagar to have a child with her. This was not unheard of in Middle Eastern culture at that time. And the maid was used as a child bearer. And so Ishmael was born. But that didn't quite satisfy God. He still was going to give him Isaac, and in the end he did. And we'll tell it in more detail as we go. But Isaac was born and the covenant made through him. He grew up, and Abraham, being careful to protect the promise of God, did not allow him to marry with the Canaanite girl, but sent his servant all the way to Haran to get a Hebrew girl out of the same family that had migrated from Ur, and sent a servant to win her for his son Isaac. The servant showed her the gifts of Isaac, and she was wooed and won and followed him back to marry this stranger of Israel. The servant is like a type of the Holy Spirit who comes to show us the things, the gifts of the bridegroom, and so we're wooed and won, and we're willing to go to the promised land with this Jewish stranger. Well, then the twins, Jacob and Esau, were born to that marriage, and the end of Abraham's life must have been amusing with these two strugglers. The brothers that really almost never got along, strife in the womb and strife their whole lives. Abraham lived to a ripe old age. In Bible times closer up to the Genesis flood, longer lifetimes obtained, different conditions obtained. But Abraham died finally in Canaan at the age of 175. Avraham v'Yitzchak, Abraham and Isaac, came to Mount Moriah. Well, this place had quite a history after they were here, and it goes on to this day. The mountain is in conflict. It's the center of three religions, of course, the Jewish, the Christian, and Muslim. All call this a holy place, and it all started back then. The first religious figure that we know of on Mount Moriah was the king priest Melchizedek. Now, he was an unusual figure. The Bible doesn't give a background for him. It's unknown who he was, except that he was appointed by God. Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek. Now, Abraham was the chosen of God, but after his victory in the north, when he rescued Lot from the Mesopotamian armies that had raided the cities down at the Dead Sea, they had taken Lot prisoner, and they had captured some booty, and they had taken it up to Dan in the north of the country. Abraham and 300-some shepherds fell on them in an Entebbe-like raid. They rescued Lot and the hostages and the booty, and it was a great victory. And Abraham came back, but not to his home. He came here to Salem, as it was called then. We call the city Jerusalem, Jeru-Salem. Well, then it seemed it was just called Salem, which is a root for shalom, peace. And Abraham came here to Salem, and he paid tithes in gratitude to the king priest Melchizedek for this victory. Melchizedek received him with bread and wine. All of these things heavily suggestive of things that happen later in the New Testament. Melchizedek is a type of Christ in that he's both king and priest of this place. Throughout the Bible, kings were kings and priests were priests. They had different offices, quite different responsibilities, but Melchizedek is called the king priest and directly appointed by God. And the type or the symbol of Messiah is established by King David in Psalm 110, the famous psalm where he establishes the deity of Messiah when he says, "The Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool. And the Lord shall send the rod of thy strength out of Zion. Rule thou in the midst of thine enemies." It's a messianic psalm. And then he says in verse 4, "The Lord hath sworn and will not repent. Thou," the Messiah, "art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Messiah is a priest forever, different from the priesthood of the Levites. They were born priests, they died, and that's the end of their office. They shall not be priests in the resurrection, but Jesus was priest always and always will be our high priest, the intercessor with the Father. He's even now in the Kodesh HaKodeshim, the Holy of Holies, in heaven. Well, Melchizedek is one personality associated with the mountain. Later on, King David, the great king of Israel who established this place as the capital, admired Mount Moriah and this location. At that time, the Jebusites controlled the place, and the city was called Yebus. It was their capital. Yebus was established around 1000 BC. David ruled in the south of here from Hebron, and he saw this strategic mountain. And when there was a plague in Israel, the plague, by the way, was caused by David counting his army, and it was an act sort of pride, and there was a plague as a punishment. The plague was moving through the Jewish population, and it stopped right here at the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. His threshing floor was the summit of Mount Moriah. That was the building that was here before the first temple. Well, David approached him and said, I want to have this place. And he built an altar to the Lord. And he said to Araunah, I'd like to buy your threshing floor. And Araunah, the Jebusite, said, he was honored by the presence of the king. He said, take it. You don't have to pay me anything. And David made a statement now famous and often repeated. He said, no, I will not sacrifice to the Lord of that which cost me nothing. And he insisted to pay for it, and he paid for the land. And then he had the idea that there ought to be a temple to God on this site. He dwelt in a palace of cedars, and the ark of the Lord dwelt within curtains, he said. It was in a temporary tabernacle. So he began to raise funds for a gigantic project, the building of the temple of God. He would not be the builder ultimately. Solomon would, because David's hands were too bloody. God wanted a man of peace. But he certainly was a fundraiser. David, out of his own treasury, gave so many ounces of gold and so many ounces of silver that if we count it up in today's prices, he raised by himself over $1 billion. Then he challenged the tribal leaders that they too should raise some funds. It was a challenge gift. And they raised on the order of $2 billion. More than $3 billion was spent on this site to build the house of the Lord. So you can imagine what it looked like. On other of our programs, we've detailed this gold and cedar wood temple, the largest temple ever made by men. Well, when Solomon finally had it up, it was called Beit HaMikdash, the Holy House. And it stood on Mount Moriah almost 400 years. You have to appreciate these time spans. Although it was so long ago, it was built in 960 BC. It stood here twice the age of the United States of America, and all during the time of the kings of the Davidic monarchy. They could look up the hill from the city of David and see this mighty tower rising, 180 feet of stone slab, like a 20-story building, already on the top of a mountain. So it was an impressive sight. It was the centerpiece of a huge campus of buildings that housed the federal government and the federal religion. But in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar and the families of the north came down on the temple. They besieged Jerusalem, they carried the people off captive, and finally they destroyed that mighty structure, which was a long and difficult job, and smashed it down until there just was nothing left. The Temple Mount was nothing but rubble. The people were taken to Babylon, and there they stayed for 70 years. They were attended by the prophets Daniel and Ezekiel, and finally they began to struggle to return. They received permission to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, to make the second temple. And they fought with the Samaritans about it. The Samaritans didn't want to see a second temple of Jerusalem go up. And from 536 BC to 516, they managed to lay the foundation of the thing. But it was a much smaller temple than Solomon's. And the old men that had seen Solomon's temple, now they were very old because the deportation lasted 70 years. So these men that must have been in their 80s and their 90s and saw the new temple, well, they gave it mixed reviews. If we look in the scripture in Ezra, who was a prophet to the temple rebuilders, Ezra 3:11, and they sang together by course in praising and giving thanks unto the Lord, because he is good, for his mercy endureth forever toward Israel. And all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. But many of the priests and Levites and chief of the fathers, who were ancient men, that had seen the first house, when the foundation of this house was laid before their eyes, they wept with a loud voice, and many shouted aloud for joy. So the people could not discern the noise of the shout of joy from the noise of the weeping of the people. For the people shouted with a loud shout, and the noise was heard afar off. The point is, you couldn't tell the crying from the cheering, because the old men were saying, this isn't the temple of God. This is just so small and insignificant. Oh, what Solomon's temple was. And then other people were cheering because God, after all, had remembered his promise, brought them back from Babylon. In a situation not unlike today, some of the chosen people came back and were in a pioneer way rebuilding the land. And they were rebuilding the temple. The difference in our situation today is the temple is not rebuilt. I can't show you a temple of God behind me right now. I could show you a Muslim shrine that's on the mount. But prophecy has it that eventually this temple will be rebuilt again. In any case, the second temple went on. It was remodeled by King Herod, restored before the time of Christ to its former magnificence. In fact, Herod's temple was so impressive. There is a traditional Jewish quotation, he who has never seen Herod's temple has never seen a beautiful building in all of his life. It was a magnificent place. Its crowning achievement of ancient days was the sacrifice of Messiah on Mount Moriah. It's the same mountain. That is, the temple on Mount Moriah leads up to the Mount of Calvary. That is a hill to the north of Moriah on the same mountain. So where Isaac was originally offered in sacrifice in 2000 BC, then 2,000 years later, when Messiah came, he too was sacrificed here on Mount Moriah. Well, now we've moved our location. We were on this hill next to the wall where we could look along the wall and see the eastern gate. Now we've moved to the summit of the Mount of Olives. This is the place where, when the Lord returns, his feet will stand right here. And this is the place where he rode the donkey on the day that he came into Jerusalem and rode into the eastern gate. You can see the gate on my right. The dome you see above it is the Muslim shrine, the Dome of the Rock. That is on the platform where the temple was. And further behind that, the old city, and then the new city of Jerusalem. This is a magnificent view. Well, when Abraham and Isaac were here, of course, there was nothing on that mountain, just the place of sacrifice and the ram caught in the thicket. But they were symbols of what was to come. They were types. What we call in the Bible a type is someone who lives a symbol of Messiah's life. And Abraham and Isaac definitely did that. Abraham was the father, and Isaac was his only son. You might say, well, there was Ishmael, but when God told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, he said, take thy son, thine only son. And then Isaac was a promised son. He didn't occur by surprise, really, but for 25 years beforehand, God had promised that Abraham would have this son. Messiah, too, is promised in advance so that when he comes, people won't have to learn a new concept of a deliverer. They've been waiting for him. Messiah was prophesied even 4,000 years in advance. In Genesis 3:15, the seed of the woman will bruise the head of the serpent, is a prophecy of Messiah coming, the Satan destroyer. Well, then there was a miraculous birth in both cases. Isaac's mother was too old to have a child. God arranged it, and she had one. Mary, the mother of Jesus, was a virgin. There was no reason she would be with child, and God arranged that one. And then the sacrifice on Mount Moriah. Isaac offered on Mount Moriah, and Jesus really sacrificed on Mount Moriah. God was only testing his friend Abraham in the case of Isaac's sacrifice, and he passed the test. But when God's turn came to give his only begotten son, he gave him there on that same mountain. Now, Abraham believed that Isaac would be risen from the dead. He believed he would be resurrected. It's the writer of Hebrews says so in Hebrews 11, verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called. In other words, he knew he was offering up his son through whom all his descendancy would rise, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. In other words, in a manner of speaking, Abraham received Isaac resurrected, brought back from the dead when he came back from Mount Moriah. Isaac walked away from his death on Mount Moriah, and Jesus walked away from his death on Mount Moriah in his resurrection. Concerning Isaac and Ishmael, when God announced that he would have this son, of course, Abraham laughed, Sarah laughed in her heart. He said he's going to call the son, God said, you'll call him Yitzchak. We'll laugh. They will laugh when this child is with them. And Isaac, of course, laughed all the time. But he says, I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Abraham had told God, oh, that Ishmael might live before thee, when he promised him the son Isaac, because he already had this son and he didn't have to wait for a miracle. But God said, no. He says, my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time in the next year. That is Genesis 17:21. So it's clear the covenant had to go through Isaac. Isaac had to come back from the sacrifice, and so Abraham believed in Isaac's resurrection. The ram, the substitutionary sacrifice, is caught in a thicket by his horn. That establishes the ram's horn, the trumpet, for deliverance of a people, as used by Joshua at Jericho, or by Gideon against the Midianites, or in the rapture of the church when the Lord returns at the sound of the trump of God. And finally, the 3 days journey. It says it took Abraham a 3 days journey to Moriah to observe this sacrifice resurrection situation. And Christ went on a 3 days journey when he was crucified and was in the grave and rose again on the third day. Avraham v'Yitzchak, Abraham and Isaac. Look at the span of the Bible. Look how far back it goes. 4,000 years. That was a great day up there on Mount Moriah. You know, Mount Moriah means the Lord provides. That's the idea of Moriah. The Lord provides. And he did. He provided the substitute sacrifice in the case of Abraham and Isaac, and of course later in the case of Messiah himself. You know, Mount Moriah today is different, of course. The structures have come and gone. The civilizations have come and gone. Whole religions have come and gone. We traced the history of it down to the culmination of the coming of Messiah on the program today. Looking at the AD centuries, the time after Messiah, why the conflict just keeps on going. Titus destroyed the temple in 70 A.D. Hadrian rebuilt a Roman temple in 135. The Muslims put their Dome of the Rock up there in 691 A.D. That was the building with the beautiful gold dome that you saw in the background. And it's been there 1,300 years, and it's in use every day. And this temple, though, it has to go too. Prophecy tells us that there will be a temple in the tribulation period, a proper Hebrew temple to God. And so evidently that will replace what is now there. And the times of the Gentiles are almost fulfilled. Luke 21:24 details a period called the times of the Gentiles, which goes from Nebuchadnezzar's invasion in 586 BC all the way out to the very end. Well, they talk about a temple rebuilding in Israel. That's not going to be easy. It's not the great synagogue. Some have said that, but that's a very modest little building, seats 600-700 people. It's really not meant to be the temple at all. The archaeology of the site, it shouldn't surprise us that one temple replaces another. It always has. It goes back to King David. It'll go forward to eternity. This is the center of the world, after all. The Talmud says that the temple is in the center of Jerusalem, Jerusalem in the center of Israel, and Israel the center of the world. Help us support this kind of programming. If you'll help us, we can do it. And Sha'alu Shalom Yerushalayim. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem.